Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about a word most people never use in their whole life. Plumb. Not plum the fruit. Plumb, with a B. It's a line a builder drops from a high point with a weight on the end, and gravity does the rest. And whatever that string says is true. It doesn't care about your opinion. It doesn't care how good the paint job is. Today's story is about a man whose entire trade is dropping that line down the side of church steeples and water towers, and about the family that spent 4 years betting he'd never pointed at them. There's a moment in this one where a man kicks in a door with a crew behind him and then stops cold in the doorway because of something he sees on a forearm, and I'll be honest, when I first mapped this story out, I thought that was the ending. It isn't. It's about the halfway point. What I want you to watch for is something quieter than that. Watch how the man in this story never once raises his voice, and how every single thing he does afterward is just him doing his actual job, in public, with witnesses. Stick with me to the end, because the last thing he climbs is not a steeple, and what's inside it has been waiting up there for 2 years. Beckett Cavanaugh had a rule about the first 10 feet, and it had kept him alive in 2 careers. The first 10 feet off the ground is where people die, he told every apprentice he ever hired, because that's the height where a man decides he isn't high enough yet to be careful. Above 40 feet, everyone is careful. Nobody has ever fallen off a 200-foot steeple because they got casual. He was 90 feet up the north face of St. Ambrose Church on the morning this story really starts, sitting in a bosun's chair with his boots braced against slate, the color of a storm, tapping the joint between the belfry louvers and the tower shaft with the flat of a chisel and listening. That was most of the job, not the climbing, the listening. Good masonry answers you with a short, bright talk, like a knuckle on a table. Bad masonry answers with a dull thud that goes nowhere, and that thud means water has been in the joint through 14 freezes and the mortar has turned to wet flour behind a face that still looks perfect from the sidewalk. Beck was 41 years old and he had a small square hand-lettered sign on the side of his truck that said, Cavanaugh Steeple and Tower Works, Weatherly Falls VT, since 2013, and under that, smaller, EST, in a barn. He restored steeples, clock towers, water tanks, grain elevators, and the occasional courthouse dome across 4 counties of Vermont, and he was the only man in Coville County licensed to sign a high-angle structural inspection. 14 churches had his signature in their files. So did the town's water tower, the covered bridge cables at Ritter's Crossing, and the cupola on the county courthouse where, later, quite a lot of this would end. Before that, he had been something else. He didn't talk about it. There was a tattoo on the inside of his left forearm, 4 inches of eagle and anchor and flintlock and trident, faded down to a bruised blue smudge because he'd spent 11 years in the sun and had never once had it touched up. If you asked, he'd say it was from a stupid week in Virginia when he was 22. It was not from a stupid week in Virginia. Marlon Tice, 63, his foreman, had worked beside him for 9 years, had seen that forearm 10,000 times, and had never asked. That was why Marlon still had the job. Down on the grass, 2 kids were arguing about a lunchbox. You said I could have the orange one. I said you could have the orange one if you carried the rope bag, and you did not carry the rope bag, Sawyer. You carried the tape measure, and the tape measure weighs 11 ounces. It weighs more than 11 ounces. It says 11 ounces on it. Etta Cavanaugh was 9 and argued like a court reporter. Sawyer was 6 and argued like weather. Their mother had been dead for 26 months, and there were still Tuesdays when Beck stood in the kitchen with a plate in his hand and forgot entirely what he had been about to do with it. Iris Cavanaugh, born Iris Pettigrew, had died of ovarian cancer at 38 in a room at Dartmouth Hitchcock with her hand on the back of her husband's neck, and the last full sentence she ever said to him was not "I love you," which she'd already said about 400 times that week, and it was not goodbye. It was, "Don't let my brother in the door." He had thought, at the time, that it was the medication. Iris had grown up in the big yellow house on Sable Ridge Road with the 2 stone gateposts, and she had spent her adult life walking away from it. Her father, Ambrose Pettigrew, had been a serious man who loved exactly 2 things, the family land and the bell tower at St. Ambrose, which the Pettigrews had endowed in 1911, and which Ambrose had personally restored in 1978, hauling copper up a ladder at the age of 51, because he didn't trust a contractor to do it. That was the man's whole personality, a deep, humorless devotion to things that outlast people. When he died, his will was strange and specific in the way that men like that write wills. It split the family holdings, and the largest piece of it, 1,100 acres of ridge, the sugar bush on the eastern slope, and the disused Cheswick quarry, did not go to his son. It went to Iris. And Iris, dying, had not left it to her husband. She had left it to Etta and Sawyer, in trust, with Beckett Cavanaugh as sole trustee, until each child turned 25, and with a clause instructing the trustee to hold, not sell. Beck had never once thought of it as money. He thought of it as a place he took the kids in October. Her brother thought of it differently. Grantham Pettigrew came to the job site at 10:40 that morning in a car that had no business on a gravel churchyard, and stood at the base of the scaffold in loafers, looking up. "Beckett, do you have 5 minutes?" "I've got about 40 feet of pointing, and then I've got 5 minutes." Grant waited 19 of them, which for Grant was a religious experience. He was 46, silver at the temples in a way he maintained, and he had the specific handsomeness of a man photographed a lot at fundraisers. He ran Pettigrew Land and Legacy out of a storefront in Montpelier, with a brass plaque and a receptionist and, as far as Beck could ever determine, 4 employees and no product. He sat on the hospital foundation board. He sponsored the Little League. Every June he stood under the bell tower at the St. Ambrose Heritage Day in a blue blazer and read the same 3 paragraphs about his father's copper work while a photographer from the county paper crouched in the grass. When Beck came down, Grant handed him a folder without preamble. "Vireo Stone and Aggregate," he said. "Out of Albany. Serious people. They want to reopen Cheswick. It's not for sale. I'm not asking you to sell it. I'm asking you to read a page." Grant smiled the fundraiser smile. "It's a lease. 25 years. Escalating. It's $410,000 a year to the trust, Beckett. Do you understand what that is for those children? That's college twice over. That's a house apiece. It's a hole in a mountain 3 miles above the village well field," Beck said. "They'd have to de-water it to get down to the good ledge. That's 140 vertical feet of water they'd have to pump somewhere for 25 years. Grant's smile stayed exactly where it was, which was interesting, because it meant he had already heard that sentence from someone else. "You're a roofer," Grant said pleasantly. "I'm a steeplejack, and I've had a plumb line on every structure in this village for 15 years, including your father's tower, which is sitting on Quarry Fill." Beck handed the folder back unopened. "Answer's no. It was no when Iris was alive, and she's the one who made it no." Grant took the folder. He looked at it for a second, and then he said, quietly, in a completely different voice, "The real one, the one underneath. You're a hired man who married up, and you're sitting on 1,100 acres you don't understand, and one day, somebody is going to explain that to you." Then he put the fundraiser smile back on, said something warm to Etta about how tall she'd gotten, and drove away. Marlon Tice spat off the edge of the scaffold and said, "I don't like that fella." "Nobody does," Beck said. "That's why he works so hard at it." Here is what Beck did not know that morning, and would not know for 11 weeks. Grantham Pettigrew had not come to ask. He had come to check. Because 18 months earlier, in a conference room in Albany, Grant had signed a document with Vireo Stone and Aggregate that he had no authority whatsoever to sign, an option agreement conveying mineral extraction rights on the Cheswick Quarry parcel and a haul road easement across Sable Ridge, contingent on delivery of clean, marketable, unencumbered title by the 30th of September. Against that option, Vireo had wired $6,400,000 into an escrow account controlled by Pettigrew Land and Legacy, of which Grant had already drawn $4,160,000 under a site preparation and title clearance line item. He had drawn it because he needed it. The Pettigrew fortune had been a slow, dignified collapse for 2 decades. Bad paper, worse timber, a Florida marina that ate $800,000 and produced a lawsuit. And Grant had kept the storefront and the blazer and the fundraiser photographs running on money he did not have. Odile Pettigrew, his mother, 71, still lived in the yellow house on Sable Ridge Road, and still had the woman come to do the silver on Thursdays, and did not know that the house had been remortgaged twice. She only knew that her son handled things, and that her daughter had married a man who climbed on roofs. And the deadline was now 4 months out, and the title was not his, and the trustee had just said no while holding a chisel. So Grant did what men like Grant do when the front door is locked. He stopped looking at the door. He looked at the trustee. The first attack came in a form so small that Beck almost missed it. On a Wednesday in June, a woman named Nova Petrakis, from the Department for Children and Families, knocked on the door of the farmhouse on Bell Kiln Road at 4 in the afternoon, apologized twice before she'd finished her first sentence, and said she was required to follow up on a report. "What's the report say?" "I'm not permitted to tell you the specifics." "Are you permitted to tell me if it's anonymous?" She hesitated. "It's anonymous." Beck stepped back and opened the door the rest of the way. He did not argue. He did not ask for a lawyer, or say the word harassment, or raise his voice 1 decibel. He showed her the kitchen, the pantry, the wood stove with the gate on it, the children's rooms, the fire extinguisher on the wall by the stairs, the ladder rack bolted through the truck bed, the first aid kit, the smoke detectors, the well test from April. He gave her Etta's pediatrician's number and Sawyer's kindergarten teacher's name. He offered her coffee, and she took it and drank it standing up. Etta, 9, said, "Are you here because of the man in the blue car?" Beck said, "Etta." "He came to Grandma Odil's when we were there, and he said Daddy wasn't coping." Nova Petrakis wrote nothing down at all, which Beck understood, and looked at the floor for a moment, which he also understood. Her report closed unsubstantiated in 9 days. The second report came 18 days after that, from a different caller, alleging that the children had been left unattended in a vehicle for 2 hours at a job site in Chelsea. That one closed unsubstantiated too, in part because the job site in Chelsea had a security camera on the parish hall that showed Adair Cavanaugh, Beck's younger sister, a school nurse, 36, who came out to sites on Fridays, specifically so she could sit with the kids, in frame for the entire 2 hours, reading a paperback in a lawn chair. The third report was the one that told Beck what he was actually looking at. It arrived on the 6th of August, and it alleged that Beckett Cavanaugh, a man with combat service and untreated post-traumatic stress, kept firearms unsecured in a home with minor children, drank in the evenings, and had on at least 2 occasions taken his 9-year-old daughter onto a 200-foot structure without fall protection. 3 of those 4 things were checkable and false. Beck had no firearms in the house at all. They were at Marlin's, in a safe, and had been since the week Iris was diagnosed. He had not had a drink since 2009. Etta had been on a structure exactly once, at 11 feet, on a barn roof, in a full harness Beck had bought her for Christmas and adjusted himself, and there were 40 photographs of it because she'd been so pleased. But the 4th thing, combat service, post-traumatic stress, was not checkable, because the record that would answer it was not a record anybody in Coville County could pull, and whoever wrote that report had known that. Somebody had told them what to put in it. The person who had told them was Sheldon Quarry, who had been the Pettigrew family attorney for 31 years, and who had spent an afternoon in June with Grant and a legal pad, sketching out what he called the architecture. The architecture had 3 floors. Floor 1 was noise. Enough reports that a paper file existed with Beckett Cavanaugh's name at the top of it. Floor 2 was a petition, Grantham Pettigrew, maternal uncle, seeking guardianship of the minors Etta and Sawyer Cavanaugh, on the grounds of the father's instability, citing the file. And floor 3, the part Quarry wrote down and then tore off the pad and burned in an ashtray, was the actual purpose. Under the terms of the Pettigrew Trust, a court-appointed guardian of the minor beneficiaries could petition for a sale or lease of trust corpus in the beneficiary's interest, and a probate judge who had been shown a $410,000 annual income stream would approve it in under an hour. Guardianship was never about the children. It was a signature machine. The hearing was set for the 11th of September in Coville County Probate Court, and it lasted 19 minutes. Bernadette Yerkes, Beck's attorney, was 58, had been doing family law in central Vermont since 1994, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had the specific unhurried cruelty of a woman who has read the file more carefully than anyone else in the room. She did not make a speech. She entered 11 exhibits. Exhibit 4 was the school attendance record. 2 absences in a year, both documented illness. Exhibit 5 was Dr. Susanna Kwan's letter, unsolicited, describing 2 children who were well, current on everything, and, in her words, conspicuously loved. Exhibit 7 was the security footage from Chelsea. Exhibit 9 was the firearm storage affidavit from a licensed dealer. Exhibit 10 was the harness receipt and the 40 photographs. Exhibit 11 was a printout of the DCF intake log showing that all 3 anonymous reports had been placed from the same landline. The landline was registered to Pettigrew Land and Legacy, 14 Barra Street, Montpelier. Judge Aurelia Thorpe took her glasses off, which everyone in that courtroom who had been there before understood to be the worst thing she did. "Mr. Quarry," she said, "does your client have anything to say about Exhibit 11? Quarry said his client had many employees and the office was open to the public. "Petition denied," Judge Thorpe said. "Guardian ad litem is discharged with the court's thanks. And Mr. Pettigrew, I've known your family my entire life. Your father used to shovel the walk in front of this building because he thought it was disrespectful for a courthouse to be icy. So I want you to hear me carefully when I tell you that if one more anonymous call about those children comes out of a building you pay rent on, I will refer it to the state's attorney myself. We're adjourned." In the parking lot, Grant did not look angry. That was the part Bernadette Yerkes noticed, and she mentioned it to Beck in the truck, and he did not forget it. "He looks like a man who just found out how much something costs," she said, "not like a man who lost." "He's got 20 days, Beck said. 20 days to what? Beck didn't know yet. He knew there was a date, because everything Grant had done for 4 months had the shape of something with a date on it. Men who are patient do not file 3 fake reports in 9 weeks. He found the date 11 days later, and he found it because of a bird. On the 22nd of September, Beck was up in the belfry of St. Ambrose, replacing a rotted louver blade, and a pigeon had gotten in behind the bell frame and died there sometime in August, and the smell had finally reached the sexton. Beck went up with a shop vac and a headlamp, and, while he was in there on his stomach with his shoulder jammed between the frame and the shaft wall, he shone the light up out of habit, because he always looked at everything, that was the whole trade, and saw, 110 feet above his head, up the inside of the spire, the underside of the copper ball that sits beneath the weather vane. And he remembered his father-in-law telling him, once, at a Thanksgiving where Ambrose Pettigrew spoke maybe 40 words total, they put a capsule in the ball. 1911. Then me, in 78. Anybody goes up there next, they'll find both. He thought about it for a full minute. Then he went back to the louver. Because the important thing that happened that week did not happen at the church. It happened in a conference room in Albany, where a Vireo Stone and Aggregate vice president named Doreen Halverstam told Grantham Pettigrew that the option expired on the 30th, that there would be no extension, that the $4,160,000 drawn against the title clearance line was repayable on demand upon expiry, and that Vireo's outside counsel had begun to ask why the recorded owner of the parcel was a testamentary trust, whose trustee had never appeared on any document. Grant drove 3 hours back to Vermont that night, and somewhere on I-89, north of Randolph, he made a phone call that would eventually be played, at considerable volume, from a church tower. Keystone Retrieval Group operated out of a low brick building outside Scranton with no sign on it, and its website used the words parental recovery 9 times and the word kidnapping 0 times. Reeve Hallstrom had founded it in 2016 after a career doing bail enforcement, and his business model was elegant and disgusting. A parent calls, distraught, says the other parent has taken the children in violation of a custody order, and Keystone goes and gets them, for between $40,000 and $90,000, plus expenses. The elegance was that Keystone did not verify the order. It required one. It scanned it. It put it in the file. The file was the shield. If the order later turned out to be garbage, Keystone had been defrauded by its own client, and Reeve Hallstrom had a lawyer on retainer whose entire job was that sentence. Grant's intake call came in at 9:14 on the morning of the 23rd of September, and like every intake call at Keystone, it was recorded, because Hallstrom's insurer required it. On that recording, Grantham Pettigrew described himself as the court-appointed guardian of 2 minor children. He described their father as a man with combat trauma, a drinking problem, and a documented history with the state's Child Protection Agency, all three of which had a paper trail he had personally built. He described the farmhouse on Bell Kiln Road. He described the children's bedrooms, upstairs, which he knew because he had been in that house at Christmas. 2 days later, he emailed the order. It was a beautiful document. It had a caption, a case number, a docket stamp, and a signature block reading H.O.N., Aurelia Thorpe, and it granted emergency ex parte temporary custody of the minors to their maternal uncle pending a hearing. Sheldon Quarry had built it out of a real order from a real 2019 case, and Dot Pruitt, 62, Notary Commission number 0114-88, who did the Pettigrew closings and had been doing them since Ambrose, had stamped and sealed the affidavit of service that went with it for $3,000 in cash, in an envelope, at her kitchen table. Every single element of that document was a felony, and at least 4 of them crossed a state line the moment it was emailed. The last call was on the 28th, at 6:40 in the evening. It was 71 seconds long. Hallstrom put Turner Braddock on speaker because Braddock always wanted the client's voice, not the file. "You understand," Braddock said. "We do this at first light, not at night, and we do it soft. Children first. No contact with the other party if we can help it." "I don't want it soft," Grant said. "He's going to be there. He's not going to hand them over. Then we withdraw, and we come back with a sheriff." "No." A pause on the recording, the sound of a car indicator. "Listen to me. Grab them and go. Whatever he does, whatever it takes, grab them and go. I don't care what happens to him." Hallstrom, later, would say under oath that he had assumed it was a figure of speech. Turner Braddock was 44 years old, and he had one thing in his life he was ashamed of, and one thing he was not allowed to be proud of, and both of them were about to walk into the same room. The shame was Coronado, 2007, Class 265. He had made it to Wednesday of Hell Week. He had quit at a surf immersion at 4:10 in the morning with the water at 58 degrees and his own voice saying words he had promised himself he'd never say, and he had spent 17 years since then building a life out of hard, adjacent, almost things. 4 years in a state corrections tactical unit, bail enforcement, then this. The thing he wasn't allowed to be proud of was his brother. Del Braddock had been a flight engineer on a Chinook. In 2011, that Chinook had gone into a wadi in the dark with a hydraulics failure and 110 miles of nothing around it, and it had been 11 hours before anybody reached them, and the men who reached them had not come by air because nothing could fly that night. They had come on foot, and they had come from the wrong direction, and there had been 9 of them, and one of them had put a tourniquet on Del Braddock's left thigh in the dark by feel, and then carried him and his radio for the first 2 miles. Turner Braddock had heard the story maybe 200 times, because his brother told it at every holiday for 8 years, until Del died of an unrelated aneurysm in 2019 at the age of 36. Del never knew any of their names. Nobody would tell him. He knew what was on their shoulders, and he knew what they wore on their forearms, and for the last 8 years of his life, every single time he told that story, he ended it the same way. "I don't know who those men were. I just know what I'd do if I ever met one." The night before, in the farmhouse on Bell Kiln Road, Sawyer Cavanaugh lost a tooth in a pancake. It was a whole production. There was screaming, then there was blood, which produced more screaming, then there was the discovery of the tooth itself, in syrup, which produced a level of joy usually reserved for lottery winners. Etta documented it with the kitchen tablet like a crime scene photographer. Beck put the tooth in a jar lid on the windowsill above the sink and told Sawyer that the going rate had gone up on account of the tooth being famous now. Then Etta got out her science fair project, which was a model of a steeple, 11 inches tall, made from balsa and cardstock, and one of her father's actual chalk lines, and she wanted to know why hers leaned. "Because your base isn't square," Beck said. He put a finger on the tiny sill plate. "Look, everything above this is fine. Your joinery's better than mine was at 9, but this corner here is about a degree out, and by the time you get to the top, a degree is 1.5 inches. So I have to start over? You have to fix the joint. That's all a steeple ever is. It's 50 joints stacked up. It never falls from the top, Etta. Nobody's steeple ever fell from the top." He tapped the base. It fails at the joint nobody inspects. She wrote that on an index card and taped it to the base of the model, in pencil, in 9-year-old handwriting. And that index card is the reason a photograph of an 11-inch balsa steeple ended up in a courtroom exhibit binder 8 months later. At 5:52 the next morning, 4 men in soft body armor with no agency markings came up Bell Kiln Road in 2 vehicles with their lights off. Beck had been awake for 40 minutes. He was in the kitchen with coffee and a clipboard, laying out the day's pointing schedule, and he heard the vehicles before he saw them. 2 engines, 1 heavy, coming up a dirt road at a speed nobody local drives at 10 to 6, and then both engines stopping at the same instant, which is not a thing that happens by accident. He was already moving when the first boot hit the porch. There is a specific sound a residential door makes when a man with 190 pounds of momentum puts a boot through the lock style, and it is not a bang. It's a splintering crack followed by a flat clatter of hardware on floorboards. Turner Braddock came through it, and 2 steps into the front hall with a light on a rail and 4 other men stacking behind him, and he shouted the thing he had shouted 600 times in his career. Hands! Hands! Let me see your hands. And Beckett Cavanaugh, standing in his own front hall in a t-shirt and canvas work pants, put both hands up, palms out, at shoulder height, very slowly, very steady, saying nothing. Braddock's light came up his chest, and across his face, and back down, and stopped. On the inside of the left forearm, 4 inches long, faded blue-gray with 17 years of sun in it, an eagle with its head down, an anchor, a flintlock pistol, and a trident. Braddock did not move for 1.5 seconds. On the audio from the body camera Van Prosper was wearing, you can hear him inhale, and you can hear his light rattle very slightly against the rail as his hand changed, and you can hear Emery Loach behind him say, "Turner, Turner, the stairs." And then Turner Braddock's voice, at a volume that made the glass in the hutch ring. "Weapons down, weapons down. Do you know whose house this is?" Nothing happened for a full second. Then Nash Dooley's muzzle went to the floor, and Tomas Escalante's went to the floor, and Van Prosper's went to the floor, and Braddock lowered his own and stepped back off the threshold with his empty hand open at his side, and said, in a completely different register, "Sir, we are backing out. We are backing out right now." Emery Loach did not lower his. Loach was 33, and he had a second contract in his phone that nobody else on that team knew about. A separate agreement with Grantham Pettigrew, $25,000, described in a text message as the extra service, to ensure that the father did not remain an obstacle after the retrieval. He had been paid 12 of it. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs with a clear line, and he was doing math. "He's not," Loach started. "Emery." Braddock didn't shout that one. "Emery, look at his arm." "I don't care what's on his arm." "You would, if you'd ever earned anything," Braddock said. What Beck did in the next 4 seconds, he did without moving his feet. He said, conversationally, "There are 2 children asleep upstairs. My daughter's room is at the top of the stairs on the left, and she is directly behind you and about 11 feet up. Whatever you're deciding, decide it knowing that." Loach's eyes went up. It was half a second of nothing. Beck crossed the hall in that half second, and he did not hit him. He took the weapon at the wrist and the receiver and rolled it out of Loach's hands the way you'd take a cup off a table, and it was on the floor behind him, and Loach was face down on the boards with his own arm folded up between his shoulder blades before anyone in the doorway had finished turning around. Beck's knee was on him. Beck's voice had not changed volume once. "Turner, is it?" "Turner Braddock." "Yes, sir." "Turner, there's a phone in his right front pocket. Don't touch it. Nobody touch it. Everybody's going to go stand in my driveway now." Etta appeared at the top of the stairs in a nightgown with her hair sideways, and Beck said, without looking up, "Sweetheart, go get your brother and go sit in the back of the truck and put the radio on. Everything's fine. There are men here who made a mistake." She looked at the 5 armed men in her father's front hall for about 2 seconds. Then she went and got her brother. The driveway conversation lasted 51 minutes, and Van Prosper's camera got all of it, because nobody thought to turn it off, and because Braddock, once he'd decided, went at it like a man in a confessional. He gave Beck the file folder from the truck. He gave him the printout of the emergency ex parte order with Judge Thorpe's forged signature on it. He gave him the client intake sheet with Grantham Pettigrew's name, address, and card on file. He told him about the recorded lines. He told him, word for word, what the client had said on the 28th at 6:40 in the evening, and then he said, "I'll say that in a courtroom. I'll say it to the state police this morning if you want." Beck read the order twice. Then he said, "This says Judge Thorpe signed it on the 19th. "Yes, sir." On the 19th, Judge Thorpe was in Burlington at her granddaughter's christening. Half this county was there. He folded it. "You never called the clerk." "No, sir." "Why?" Braddock looked at his boots for a while. He was a large man, and he made himself smaller doing it. "Because I've been doing this 8 years, and the ones with a file are the ones you don't have to think about." Then he said, "Can I tell you something you're going to think is a line?" "Go ahead." "My brother was on a Chinook that went down in a wadi in 11. 9 guys walked in on foot and got them out. He told that story until the day he died." Braddock's jaw moved. He never knew who they were. He knew what they had on their arms. Beck said nothing for a long moment. A logging truck went by, out on the county road. "I wasn't there," he said finally, which was true, and which he said in a way that made it clear that this was the entire answer anyone was ever going to get, and Braddock, who had spent 17 years around men who told him things, understood exactly what that meant, and never asked again. By 8:15, there were 3 Vermont State Police cruisers in the yard. By 10, Emery Loach was in custody in Berlin, and his phone was in an evidence bag. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a woman named Detective Imogen Barlow was sitting at Beck's kitchen table with a legal pad, saying the words conspiracy and interstate, and "We are going to want to be very careful and very slow about this, Mr. Cavanaugh." And Beck was nodding and pouring coffee and thinking about a copper ball 110 feet above a church floor. Grantham Pettigrew found out at 9:20 that morning from Reeve Hallstrom in a phone call that lasted 11 seconds and consisted mostly of Hallstrom saying the phrase, "You are not a guardian," 3 times. By noon, Grant had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to get out in front of it. He called the county paper himself. He was, he said, devastated. He had hired a family reunification service in good faith on the advice of counsel, believing he held a valid emergency order. He had been misled. He was cooperating fully. His only concern had ever been for his late sister's children. It played for about 9 days. That's the thing people underestimate about men like Grant. The blazer works. The Little League sponsorship works. There were people in Weatherly Falls that October who genuinely believed that poor Grant had been taken advantage of, and that Beckett Cavanaugh, the quiet one, the one from away, the one who'd married Iris Pettigrew and then somehow ended up with the Ridge, had somehow engineered all of it. Deputy Wyland Gurr believed it loudest. Gurr had gone to school with Grant, had been on the Pettigrew payroll for 11 years, in ways that never showed up as a payroll, and pulled Beck over twice in that first fortnight, once for a chain rating on the ladder rack and once for nothing at all. The second time, Beck sat with both hands on the wheel while Gurr walked around the truck for 6 minutes, and then said, pleasantly, through the window, "Deputy, do you know the name of the man who signs the county's high-angle inspection on the courthouse cupola every March?" Gurr said he did not care. "I do," Beck said, "so I'd hate for anybody to ever think that man had a reason to be sloppy." Gurr didn't pull him over again. Meanwhile, the machinery Beck actually cared about was assembling itself in his kitchen, one person at a time. Detective Imogen Barlow brought Emery Loach's phone contents on the 9th of October, the second contract, the $12,000 transfer, and the text string in which Grant had written, at 11:41 p.m. on the 28th of September, the sentence, "The extra service is on top of the retainer, no paper." Barlow also brought bad news, which she delivered honestly, which is why Beck trusted her for the rest of his life. The forged order was a state case and a federal one. Loach was going away. Quarry would be charged. Grant would be charged. And Grant's lawyers would spend 18 months negotiating it down to a paper crime, forgery, false swearing, maybe conspiracy, and he would very likely serve less time than Loach, and none of it would touch the money. "The money's the whole thing," Beck said. "The money's a civil matter, and it's in Albany, and it's behind an escrow agreement with 4 signatures on it," Barlow said. I can't get there from here. Alonzo Reddy got there from somewhere else. Rede was 43, worked out of the FBI's Boston field office on the child abduction rapid deployment team, wore terrible ties, and had known Beck since 2004 in a context neither of them ever described in a room with other people in it. He drove up on a Saturday, sat on the porch steps for 2 hours, ate an entire tray of Adair's cornbread, and looked at the escrow agreement for 11 minutes. Then he said, "This is not a custody case. This is wire fraud." He took $6.4 million from a company in New York, against title he doesn't own, and he moved $4 million of it. That's 10 counts before breakfast. But, he tapped the page. Vireo has to be a victim. Right now, Vireo thinks it's a buyer with a paperwork problem. The second they think they're a victim of a fraud, their general counsel calls us and the whole thing turns federal in a week. So somebody has to show Vireo what they bought. Somebody has to show them in a way they can't unsee, in front of their own board, Reddit said, and preferably in front of a photographer. Beck was quiet for a while. There's a photographer at Heritage Day every year, he said. The last person to arrive came on her own, on a bicycle, in the rain, on the 22nd of October. Renly Pettigrew was 16, Grant's daughter, and she had her Aunt Iris's exact chin, which was the first thing Beck noticed, and the thing that made it hard to look at her. She stood in the door of the shop with her hood up and water coming off her sleeves and said, "I'm not here to apologize for him. I want to be clear about that, because I think that's what you think this is. All right?" He kept a book. She pulled a phone out of a plastic bag inside her jacket. Not a computer file, an actual book, a green ledger, in the desk in the study, and he writes in it every Sunday night, and he's done it since I was little because Grandpa did it. It's got the Vireo money in it. It's got payments in it. It's got a page that says KRG on it. She swallowed. I photographed 41 pages of it in August, because Dad told my grandmother that you were unstable, and I heard him laughing about it 4 minutes later on the phone. Beck did not take the phone. He said, "Does anyone know you're here?" "No." "Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to put that back in your pocket, and I'm going to call Detective Barlow and Bernadette Yerkes and get you an attorney of your own, today, paid by me. And you are going to hand those photographs to law enforcement in a room with your own lawyer in it and a legal guardian who is not your father. And nobody is ever going to be able to say a 16-year-old girl was pressured by the man her family was fighting." He handed her a towel. "And you're going to eat something, because you biked 11 miles. Ren cried then, once, hard, for about 20 seconds, and then stopped and ate 2 bowls of chili and asked Etta a serious question about balsa joinery. That night, Beck sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did what he'd done 100 times before a hard climb, which was to write down every load path and ask which one fails first. He wrote, paper, state, slow, small. He wrote, phone, loach, real, but it's one man. He wrote, ledger, Ren, real, and it's her, and I won't spend her. He wrote, escrow, needs Vireo. He wrote, water. And he circled water 3 times, hard enough to go through the page. Because Beckett Cavanaugh had spent 15 years with a plumb line on every structure in that village, and there was a fact about the Cheswick quarry that Grantham Pettigrew had never once thought about, because Grant had never in his life gone up a ladder to find out whether something was true. The fact was this: the Cheswick quarry had flooded in 1961 and had been a 200-foot deep lake of green water ever since. And the reason it flooded was that the ledge under Sable Ridge is fractured limestone, and fractured limestone is not a bathtub, it's plumbing. The quarry, the village well field, and the 61 feet of engineered fill under the St. Ambrose bell tower were all connected through the same fracture set, and the whole village's water, and the ground under Ambrose Pettigrew's tower, sat on the pressure that flooded pit provided. De-water Cheswick to reach the good ledge, and you don't just move water. You drop the head across the whole fracture field. You dry the village wells, and you consolidate 61 feet of saturated fill under a 190-foot masonry tower. Beck had written that in an inspection report in March 2019. It was 3 sentences long, on page 4, under adjacent site conditions. Nobody had read it, including the church. There were 3 things he needed. The first was proof, and proof came in a small brown bottle. Ivor Lindegard was a hydrogeologist with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, 61, and he had wanted to run a tracer test on the Cheswick fracture set since 2011 and had never had a reason his budget would accept. Beck gave him one on the 14th of November by filing a formal structural concern on a listed historic building, which the state has to answer. On the 2nd of December, they put 400 grams of fluorescein dye into the quarry water at 3 depths. 19 days later, it came out of the village well field at 0.4 parts per billion, and out of a spring below the church at 1.1, and Ivor Lindegard sat in his truck in the churchyard looking at a handheld fluorometer and said, out loud, to nobody, "Oh, that is a beautiful, horrible little number." The second thing he needed was the tower itself, and here Beck did something that took nerve, because it cost him money, and it made him look, for a month, exactly like the man Grant had been describing. He wrote a letter to the diocese, to the town, and to the County Historic Preservation Office, in his own name, on his own letterhead, stating that in his professional opinion, the St. Ambrose bell tower was in a condition of active differential settlement at the northeast pier, that he estimated the remaining service life under current conditions at 15 to 25 years, and that any reduction in groundwater head at the site would shorten that to a period he was not willing to put in writing. Half the village decided he was attacking Ambrose Pettigrew's tower out of spite. Odile Pettigrew wrote a letter to the paper about it. The paper printed it. Grant read that letter and did exactly what Beck had built the letter to make him do. He decided Beckett Cavanaugh was cracking. And so on the 4th of January, through Bernadette Yerkes, a settlement overture arrived at Grant's attorney's office, and it read like a broken man. The trustee was open to discussing a limited-term lease of the Cheswick parcel. The trustee wished to avoid further litigation for the children's sake. The trustee would require a public execution of a trustee consent and full disclosure of the underlying agreement, in view of the recent regrettable publicity, so that the community could see that the arrangement was above board. Grant read that word, public, and he heard it the way a peacock hears an audience. He countered within 9 days. He proposed that the signing take place at the St. Ambrose Heritage Day on the 14th of June, at the Tower, where his father's copper work was celebrated every year, with the county paper present, and with Vireo's people invited, to put this family's difficulties behind us, in the place my father loved. Bernadette Yerkes read the counter twice, took her glasses off, and said, "Beckett, I've been doing this 30 years, and I want to say for the record that I find this genuinely frightening." "Say yes," Beck said. The third thing he needed was up 110 feet of interior spire, and he went and got it on a Sunday in March with Marlin Tice on the ground and a headlamp and 40 minutes of ladder and rope. The copper ball under the weather vane at St. Ambrose is 11 inches across, and it unthreads from the spindle if you have a pipe wrench and no fear of what's under your feet. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 objects. One was a tin cylinder soldered shut, dated 1911, containing a subscription list and a newspaper. The other was a plastic document sleeve, and it had been put there in June of 2022, which Beck knew because he had watched Iris go up that ladder that month, 60 pounds lighter than she should have been, 4 weeks past her last treatment that did anything. In a harness, Beck had adjusted himself, because she had said she wanted to see the valley from her father's tower one time before she couldn't. It had taken her 50 minutes. He had thought it was a goodbye. She had been filing. Inside the sleeve was a first codicil to the last will and testament of Iris Ann Cavanaugh, executed the 9th of June 2022, witnessed by 2 people, Marlin Tice and a hospice nurse named Georgia Ipswich, and notarized by a notary in Lebanon, New Hampshire, who had no idea who the Pettigrews were. It was 4 paragraphs. The operative one said that in the event any lineal descendant of Ambrose Pettigrew petitioned any court for guardianship, conservatorship, or custody of her children, or sought to compel a sale, lease, or encumbrance of the Cheswick or Sable Ridge parcels, that person's entire remaining interest in the Pettigrew family holdings, including the yellow house on Sable Ridge Road, in which Odile Pettigrew held only a life estate, would immediately and irrevocably revert to the trust for the benefit of Etta and Sawyer Cavanaugh. There was a 5th paragraph, handwritten, that was not operative and was not legal, and was addressed to one person. "Beck," it said. "He'll come for them. He won't come at you, he'll come at the paper. because he's never in his life put his hand on anything real. Don't argue with him. Just make him sign something in front of people. And take the kids up here in October. The maples on the east slope go first. He sat on a plank 90 feet above a church floor in the dark and read that 4 times. Then he threaded the ball back onto the spindle, torqued it, checked the vanes swing, and climbed down, because he had a job at 8, and because the 14th of June was 92 days away, and there was a great deal to organize. Between March and June, Beck did 4 quiet things and 1 loud one. The quiet ones. He had Bernadette Yerkes file the codicil with the Coville County Probate Court on the 2nd of June, sealed, with a motion to be heard on the 16th. He had Ivor Lindegard's tracer report finalized, peer-reviewed by a second hydrogeologist at UVM, and stamped. He had Wren Pettigrew's 41 ledger photographs handed to Detective Barlow and Special Agent Reed in a conference room in Waterbury, with Wren's own attorney and her Aunt Delphine sitting beside her. And on the 11th of April, Sheldon Quarry, 67, 31 years at the bar, looking at document forgery, notary fraud, and a federal conspiracy count, sat down with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Burlington and started talking, and did not stop for 4 hours. The loud one was this. In April, Beckett Cavanaugh donated his labor to St. Ambrose to rebuild the Belfry louvers, repoint the Northeast Pier, and replace the tower's 1974 amplifier and speaker horns with a modern unit, at cost, as a gift to the parish in memory of Iris Cavanaugh. The vestry was delighted. It was in the bulletin. Odile Pettigrew, who had spent 7 months telling people he was attacking her husband's tower, had to sit through the announcement. Nobody thought about it again, because nobody thinks about a public address system. The 14th of June was a bright, hot Saturday. Heritage Day at St. Ambrose draws about 400 people. Pie table, a fiddle group, the fire department's antique pumper, kids on the grass, the photographer from the county paper, a young man named Pelham Roscoe who had been covering Grant's blazer for 6 years, set up early. Grantham Pettigrew arrived at 11 with a folding table, a leather portfolio, Dot Pruitt and her notary stamp, and 3 people from Vireo Stone and Aggregate, Doreen Halverstam, a project engineer named Sunil Ferreira, and Vireo's outside counsel, a very quiet man named Perrin Ostland, who had flown in from Albany that morning, and whose presence Grant had interpreted as enthusiasm. Beck came at 11:40 with Etta, Sawyer, Adair, Marlon Tice, Bernadette Yerkes, and a cardboard document tube under his arm. Grant made a speech first. Of course he did. He stood with the tower behind him and talked for 6 minutes about his father's copper, about stewardship, about how families in small places have hard years, about how his sister had loved this valley, and there were people in that crowd, good people, who teared up. Then he said, "And so, today, my brother-in-law and I are going to sign an agreement that puts my sister's land to work for her children." Beck stepped up to the table. He did not take the microphone. He said, "Before I sign anything, Grant, you sign the consent." That was the deal. In front of everybody, like you asked. Grant smiled and picked up the pen. It was 3 pages. He had read the first one. It said what he expected it to say, that the parties intended to negotiate a lease of the Cheswick parcel in good faith. Page 2 was the schedule of representations. Beck watched him not read it. Grant signed all 3 pages, and Dot Pruitt stamped and sealed each one with her commission number, and Pelham Roscoe took 11 photographs of it, and about 200 people watched, and somewhere in the crowd Special Agent Alonzo Reed lowered his phone. Paragraph 4c, on page 2, was 1 sentence. The signatory represents and warrants that he has entered into no agreement with any third party concerning the subject parcels, and has received no funds, consideration, deposit, or option payment from any person in respect of them. He had signed it in front of a notary, a photographer, and the counterparty, who had wired him $6,400,000. Then Beck said, "Can I say something about Ambrose?" The crowd made the sound crowds make. Grant, magnanimous, gestured at the microphone. Beck took it. He said, "Ambrose Pettigrew went up this tower at 51 years old because he didn't believe a man should certify something he hadn't touched. I've thought about that a lot this year. He looked out at 400 people. So I want everybody to hear something I touched." And he pressed a button on a small remote in his palm, and the horns in the belfry, his horns, mounted in April, aimed down into the churchyard, rated for a village, came on. The recording was 71 seconds long. Reeve Hallstrom's insurer had required it. The FBI had a certified copy and had cleared its release. Braddock had authenticated it in an affidavit in March. Grantham Pettigrew's voice came off 190 feet of masonry and rolled across the grass at a volume you could feel in the pie table. Listen to me. Grab them and go. Whatever he does, whatever it takes, grab them and go. I don't care what happens to him. The fiddle group stopped. A child asked a question and was shushed. Doreen Halverstam turned her whole body toward Grant very slowly. Perrin Ostland did not turn at all. He took out a pen. Beck let 4 seconds of silence go by. Then he said, "Those children were 11 feet above that man's boot when he was told to do that. My daughter came to the top of the stairs." Odile Pettigrew sat down on a folding chair very suddenly and stayed there. What happened over the next 9 minutes was not shouting. It was worse than that. It was procedural. Ivor Lindegard walked up with a manila folder and handed it, physically, to Sunil Ferreira and said, "You'll want to see this before you spend another $1. Fluorescein trace, December, 400 grams. It's in the village wells in 19 days, and it's in the spring under this building. You cannot dewater Cheswick. Whoever told you that pit was isolated was guessing." Bernadette Yerkes handed a second folder to Perrin Ostland, then read 3 sentences from a third one out loud. The operative paragraph of Iris Cavanaugh's first codicil, executed the 9th of June 2022, and the fact, which she stated flatly and without emphasis, that Grantham Pettigrew had petitioned the Coville County Probate Court for guardianship of Etta and Sawyer Cavanaugh on the 11th of September, and had thereby, by his own hand, extinguished every interest he and his mother held in the Pettigrew estate, 9 months ago, in a courtroom, on the record. Grant said, that isn't valid. She wasn't. She was examined by 2 physicians that week, Bernadette said. One of them is standing right there. Detective Imogen Barlow and 2 troopers came across the grass from the direction of the pie table, and Special Agent Reed came from the other side, and Grantham Pettigrew was arrested at 12 Tay. 19 p.m. on the 14th of June, under the tower his father had restored, in a blue blazer, on state charges of forgery, false swearing, and conspiracy, and on a federal complaint charging wire fraud and conspiracy against rights, with Pelham Roscoe of the county paper standing 11 feet away. Dot Pruitt, 62, who had stamped the seal on the forged affidavit of service in exchange for $3,000 in an envelope, watched them put his hands behind his back, and then walked over to Detective Barlow entirely on her own and said, "I need to tell you what I did." Etta Cavanaugh, 9, standing beside her father in a churchyard with 400 people in it, said, "Dad, is it because of the joint?" Beck said, "Yeah, kiddo. It was the joint nobody inspected. It took 14 months to finish, because real things do. Vireo Stone and Aggregate did not sue the trust, because the trust had never signed anything. Vireo sued Grantham Pettigrew and Pettigrew Land and Legacy in the Northern District of New York for fraud in the inducement, and Perrin Ostland's complaint attached, as Exhibit A, the 3-page consent Grant had signed on a folding table in a churchyard while a photographer took 11 pictures of him doing it. Paragraph 4C is quoted twice. The federal case never went to trial. It didn't need to. Sheldon Quarry had been talking since April. Dot Pruitt confessed on the church lawn. Turner Braddock testified for 2 days, and the recording was the recording. Grantham Pettigrew pleaded to wire fraud, conspiracy against rights, and forgery of a judicial document, and was sentenced on the 8th of August to 19 years. Emery Loach went to trial, because Emery Loach had a theory, and the jury was out for 4 hours. Attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, and a firearms count, 11 years. Sheldon Quarry was disbarred and got 40 months. Dot Pruitt, who had cooperated from the first minute and cried through her entire allocution, got 14 months and lost her commission. Deputy Wyland Gurr was indicted on obstruction and official misconduct after Barlow's team pulled 6 years of his call records and resigned. He is not in prison, which Beck thinks about sometimes and has decided not to be eaten by. Keystone Retrieval Group dissolved in the second week of the civil suits. Reeve Hallstrom, who had built a business on the principle that a scanned document is a shield, discovered that it is not, and pleaded to a conspiracy count of his own, 51 months. Turner Braddock was charged too. He had put a boot through a door with a rifle in his hands, and the law does not have a category for a man who did that and then stopped. He faced 8 years. Beckett Cavanaugh wrote a letter to the U.S. attorney. It was 2 pages. It said, in substance, this man's crew was in my hallway, above my children, and the only reason nobody in my family died that morning is that Turner Braddock made the right call in 1.5 seconds with no time to think about it, and then gave me the file that made every other conviction in this case possible. It said, I don't require him to be punished. It said, in the last line, I was not in that wadi in 2011, but I know men who were, and I know exactly what they'd want done here. Braddock pleaded to a single count of unlawful entry, served 9 months, and now works for a nonprofit in Pennsylvania that consults on parental abduction cases for free and spends most of its energy telling desperate parents that a scanned court order is worth nothing until you have called the clerk of that court and heard a human being say the case number out loud. He calls Beck twice a year. They never talk about 2011. The codicil held. The probate court found it valid on the 16th of June, and Grantham and Odile Pettigrew's entire remaining interest in the family holdings reverted to the trust for Etta and Sawyer. The yellow house on Sable Ridge Road with the 2 stone gateposts went to the children of the daughter who had spent her adult life walking away from it. Beck did not sell it, and he did not throw Odile Pettigrew out of it. He drove up there in September with Bernadette Yerkes and sat in the front room and told a 71-year-old woman who had written a letter to the newspaper about him that she could stay in the house until she died, rent-free, taxes paid by the trust, on one condition, that Wren, who was 17 and had nowhere to be, could have the whole east wing and a key of her own and would never again be asked to defend what she had done. Odile Pettigrew looked at the floor for a long time and then said the only decent sentence she said in this entire story, which was, Iris would have done exactly this, and she would have been just as unpleasant about it. The Cheswick Quarry and 1,100 acres of Sable Ridge went into a permanent conservation easement in November, held by a land trust, with a trailhead, a small parking area, and a bronze plate at the gate that reads, The Iris Cavanaugh Ridge, Water, Maples, and Nobody's Business. Etta chose the wording. The village's wells were never touched. Ivor Lindegard's tracer study is now cited in 2 state groundwater manuals, which is the closest thing to fame a hydrogeologist gets. The St. Ambrose bell tower got a real repair in the spring, a full underpinning of the northeast pier, funded by a grant Beck applied for and a settlement contribution from the Vireo litigation, and it will now stand for another century, which is exactly what Ambrose Pettigrew would have cared about, and exactly the opposite of what his son did with his name. And on an October afternoon, 14 months after a man kicked in a door, a steeplejack stood on a plank, 90 feet up the north face of that tower, with his daughter clipped in beside him, in a harness he had adjusted himself, and handed her the end of a chalk line with a brass plumb bob on it. Drop it, he said. Don't throw it. Let it find its own way down. Etta let it out through her fingers, slow, and the bob swung and steadied and hung, dead still, 90 feet of string, with gravity's opinion on the end of it, 1.5 inches off the face of the stone at the bottom. It's out, she said. It is. Is that bad? That's honest, her father said. It's only bad if nobody drops the line. Down on the grass, a 6-year-old with a new front tooth was yelling something about a lunchbox. So that's the story, and I want to sit with one thing before we go. The moment everybody's going to remember from this is the doorway. A man with a rifle sees a faded tattoo and screams weapons down, and it's a great moment, and honestly it's why I wanted to tell you this one. But I think it's the least useful part. Because that moment only worked because of luck, because of who happened to be standing in that doorway, and because of a brother in a wadi in 2011. If Turner Braddock had been anybody else, that hallway ends differently, and no amount of tattoo saves anyone. You cannot build a life on somebody else recognizing you. What actually saved those kids was 15 years of boring. It was a man who wrote a 3-sentence note about groundwater on page 4 of a report nobody read in 2019. It was a harness receipt and 40 photographs. It was a guy who never once raised his voice in a courtroom parking lot, and who, when he finally moved by making his enemy sign a piece of paper in front of a photographer. He didn't beat Grantham Pettigrew with violence. He beat him with a document, a dye test, and a public address system he'd installed as a gift. And here's the part I keep chewing on. Grant lost because he had never in his life gone up a ladder to check whether something was true. He inherited a name. He wore the blazer. He gave the speech under his father's tower every June, and he never once touched the tower. Beck touched everything. That's the whole difference between those two men, and it's the whole story. So drop the line. On your finances, on the people who tell you they're handling it, on the joint in your own house that nobody has looked at in 9 years. It doesn't matter how good the paint is. Nothing falls from the top. It fails at the joint nobody inspects. If this one got you, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps. And tell me down in the comments, what's the plumb line you've been putting off dropping? I read them. I'll see you in the next one.